安先生、李神父，谢谢陪主教，热情欢迎。I'm so happy to be here, reunited with old friends. 有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎。
Amen.
So I'll begin with a short story commonly recounted to Chinese school children. In ancient times, an old man used wood from his hill to produce firewood, and before he died, he gave the hill to his two sons, Hongshan and Qingshan. Some of us already know this story. Hongshan used all of the trees on his side of the hill to produce firewood, and then planted crops where the trees had once been. Qingshan, on the other side of the hill, planted new trees after he had used some to produce firewood, and also grew crops among the trees. After a storm came and destroyed Hongshan's crops, he went to ask his brother for help. Qingshan's advice is now famous in China. Quote, "If one lives on a hill but does not protect its trees, he will be ruined. But by protecting the hill, he will enjoy success later on." This story is recounted in the very simple axiom, 留得其上在，不怕我柴烧, or by keeping the hill green, there is no fear of lacking firewood. So tonight, I'd just like to say a little bit about this saying and sort of connect it to the church in China. Chinese Catholics have, like Qingshan, lived on the hill of Christian faith for centuries through eras of flourishing, struggle, acceptance, rejection, connection with the outside, and isolation from within. But the point of my remarks today is to highlight how China's church has always kept the hill green and has thus always known the hope of success. I visited the tomb of Matteo Ricci in Beijing so many times, and one of the aspects of his life in China that most impresses me is that he always balanced his efforts as a missionary with equal determination to become more like the Chinese that he met in order to more effectively become their friend. After Ricci died in Beijing in 1610, a manuscript written by him in Italian was discovered among the papers he left behind. His confrere, Nicolas Trigot, brought these papers back to Rome with him in 1614 and published Ricci's narrative account of the mission in China in 1615 under the title De Christiana Expeditione apud Sinas, or On the Christian Mission in China. Not only does this work represent the earliest history of the mission in the empire, but it also reveals the high extent of Ricci's commitment to bringing Christianity to China. In one passage, he describes poignant examples of Christian conversion in Shaozhou. Ricci praises the efforts of his friend, Father Niccolo Longobardo, for successfully converting a large number of locals. Ricci writes that following the rites of baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion, the new Chinese Catholics celebrated with spectacle more common of high officials than religious converts. Quote, "After returning to their homes, they were led out by the other converts to the sound of cymbals and trumpets. With the same display, they are accustomed to make for a magistrate who had been promoted to a new dignity. During a period of 3 years, the Lord saw this harvest grow to 300 followers, a considerable number considering the difficulties encountered at the beginning," close quote. Now, following this example of how Chinese converts celebrated their reception into the church, Ricci enumerates a list of converts and their circumstances that they had during their conversions. He begins with an account of a 70-year-old man who, quote, "counseled others of his own age and led them into the church." Here we see one of the earliest examples of the missionary instinct to entrust the charge of spreading Christianity to the local population rather than reserve this enterprise for only Western missionaries. I point out this passage in which Matteo Ricci discusses conversions because it is too often asserted that Ricci and his fellow Jesuits were mainly interested in science, cartography, and secular philosophy, and that their religious vocations floated inconspicuously in the background. There can be little doubt that Ricci published secular works while living in China. His 1607 collaboration to publish Euclid's Elements in Chinese is a good example of his efforts to expose Western science to China's literati. In a 1609 letter to the Father General of the Society of Jesus, Claudio Acquaviva, Ricci wrote, quote, "There is great hope in the abundant fruit that is to be gained from such a vast kingdom as China. For in this kingdom, learning and consequently all sciences and opinions founded on reason are held in high esteem. And that is why it will be simple to persuade the rulers of this kingdom with our holy faith through evidence provided by reason, and if they concede, it will be easy to convert everyone else," close quote. Despite the fact that Ricci over-optimistically predicted that converting China to Catholicism would be, quote, simple, he astutely observed that science and reason would serve as effective methods of gaining attention and building bridges in the Ming Empire. Ricci may have published scientific books, produced a world map, and mastered the Confucian classics, but underscoring all of these endeavors was an abiding conviction that his labors were entirely meant to lead others to God. But here I should insert a note on how both Ricci's secular and religious efforts were never disconnected from his sense that friendship must be valued, even if conversion never happens. For Ricci, both conversion and community were important, even if community might be the only result of his work in China. Father Anthony Husserl recently pointed out important evidence of Ricci's habit of collaboration while serving in China. This evidence appears in the preface of his Chinese translation of Euclid's Elements, published in Beijing under the title Ji He Yuanwen. In the preface of this translation, we find an interesting assertion. The work is described as Li Ma Dou Kou Yi, Xu Guang Qi, Bi Shou, or orally dictated by Matteo Ricci and written down by Xu Guang Qi. One imagines Ricci and his friend Xu Guang Qi sitting together, drinking warm tea, collaborating on a book that is now among the most famous Chinese translations of Western science during the Ming and Qing dynasties. And this represents only one of countless collaborations between Chinese and Western literati during China's missionary era that have resulted in the rich Sino-Western exchange of religious, philosophical, and scientific knowledge. But during the 17th and 18th centuries, the disputes over Christian terms and the Confucian rites created gaping fissures in China's relationship with the West. And by 1775, the Jesuit order was suppressed in China, and the Catholic community was living its first era of enduring underground. The so-called 底下教会, or underground church, has roots long before the 1950s and 60s. Before I finally discuss the Chinese Catholic Church as it looks in the 20th and 21st centuries, I should acknowledge China's difficult journey toward indigenization, or what I strongly prefer to call localization. I prefer the term localization because the idea of indigenization of the Chinese church has been largely driven by non-Chinese. And I find it problematic when non-Chinese ecclesiastics promote their own ideas of what a, quote, Chinese church should look like, without more generously allowing the Chinese themselves to form such a vision. One thing that Chinese Catholics have always held to be important for creating their own localized church is the establishment of a Chinese hierarchy, Chinese bishops governing Chinese faithful. Most Chinese Catholics have never desired a Chinese hierarchy independent of the Holy See. Some do, but rather one that, like all other local churches, is overseen by people of their own nation and culture. The first Chinese bishop, Gregory Wenzhou, I should say a Dominican, was consecrated in 1685, and no other Chinese priest was made a bishop until 1926, when Pope Pius XII consecrated 6 priests to the episcopate in St. Peter's Basilica. It took 241 years until native Chinese were again allowed to govern their own church. When writing of the 1926 ordination of 6 Chinese bishops, the Jesuit scholar Father Pascale Delia asserted that, quote, "A mission is a transitory step. What is permanent is the church. The mission, therefore, has to give up its place to the permanent church," close quote. In other words, by the early 20th century, the era of Western authority over the Chinese church was at long last being challenged by Western missionaries. Now, 2 rare film clips filmed in the 1920s serve to illustrate this sea change. Very few people have seen these film clips, actually. Both clips were filmed by a Columban father, Father Richard Rodigan. And the first one shows an Irish Columban missionary in rural China making a visit to a small Catholic community around 1921. Now, notice how the Chinese faithful were expected to bow and kowtow to the missionary, a practice that was criticized by most Chinese, in fact nearly all, and disagreed upon by the Western missionary community. So let's just watch a moment of this clip about 1921. One rarely sees films with the xiaojiao, with bound feet. Among the most adamant promoters of the localization of the first Chinese church were Father Vincent Leb and the first papal diplomat to China, Archbishop Celso Benito Costantini. Costantini, despite opposition from several of his fellow bishops in China, all Western, convened in Shanghai what he called the Primum Concilium Sinensi, or First Plenary Council for China, held at the Jesuit church named after St. Ignatius of Loyola, now is the cathedral in Shanghai. China's bishops gathered to discuss how to localize the Chinese church in all areas, from theology and liturgy to art and architecture. And as the bishops formally processed from the church, it became evident that another topic must be confronted: the overwhelming majority of non-Chinese leaders who governed Chinese Catholics. In this second film clip, which I'll show you in a moment, we see just how visibly Western bishops overshadow the Chinese in their own nation. And for those of you who recognize the name, pay special attention to the end of the clip for a rare, very rare film appearance of the famed Shanghai Catholic Joseph Liu Bohong wearing his distinctive dark sunglasses. So this is 1924, Shanghai, the Jesuit church, St. Ignatius. For those of you who know about Saint Versiglia, he is in the left now. And what may be one of the only, if not the only, film examples of Costantini in China. Here he is. And for those of you who know, Lu Bohong was a great supporter of the church in Shanghai and wore sunglasses because he felt himself so attractive that he thought by shading his eyes he would protect women from lust. There he is. Under Costantini's direction, a new wave of what we might call Sinicized Catholic art and architecture began to punctuate China's vast religious landscape. Print and carved images of Our Lady of China became more widely produced. Churches began to adopt Chinese aesthetic sensibilities, and liturgical vestments and vessels were made in Chinese designs and with Chinese materials. And not surprisingly, by the 1930s, the desire to allow Chinese Catholics to worship in a Chinese way even spread to the United States. When the Chinese community of San Francisco established the St. Mary's Chinese Day School in 1921, the Paulist fathers there, overseeing the school, attempted to follow Costantini's example by encouraging the students to wear their native clothing and pray both in English and in Chinese. This is in San Francisco. During the centenary celebration of the school, old film footage was discovered and recovered that highlights the attempt to Sinicize even those Chinese who worship outside of China. So you'll notice in this very brief clip, which I'll show you in a moment, you'll notice in this very brief clip that while the students were wearing Chinese clothing, they nonetheless were taught to intone Latin, the Latin and Greek chants common of the Mass in 1936, when this film was filmed in San Francisco. Great old film footage. Despite the genuine challenges that Chinese Catholics have faced in recent decades, the post-1949 era church in China has grown more localized than ever before. The inauguration of and these are some pretty intense images I got from the archive in Shanghai. The inauguration of the Tianzhujiao Aigu Hui, or Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, on 15 July 1957, marks both the empowerment of China's bishops, clergy, and faithful, as well as the division of China's bishops, clergy, and faithful. Even before the Patriotic Association was founded, Chinese Catholics were already growing more divided due to the complexities of living a faith that requires loyalty to a leader abroad, while being required to also render loyalty to the national government. Once foreign missionaries were expelled during the 1950s, China's hierarchy was at long last exclusively Chinese. As Beatrice Leung and William Liu have argued, this new reality was complicated, however, by the fact that, as they put it, quote, independence from Rome under the firm control of the state and party placed Catholics loyal to the Pope in an awkward position. A number of bishops, regular clergy, sisters, and faithful understood this, quote, independence as untenable and formed a clandestine underground community in China. So each community had its leaders. Each community had its heroes. For the so-called underground community, the long-imprisoned Bishop of Shanghai, Ignatius Gongpingmei, was heralded as the icon of resistance. What is important to note about this unfortunate division in the Catholic Church in China is that it is much more complex and nuanced than most popular media sources suggest. Bishop Jin Luxian, a Jesuit, for example, represents a contingent of the sanctioned Catholic community that operate within the government's official framework while persistently insisting on spiritual and doctrinal obedience to the Holy See. Both Gongpingmei and Jin Luxian were committed to the Church's survival in modern China, but both men approached this goal in different ways. In 1954, when China's government and the Catholic hierarchy were playing a game of ideological tug-of-war, Shanghai's Bishop Gongpingmei made a public announcement that stirred the faithful of the country. He said, quote, "If we renounce our faith, we will disappear and there will not be a resurrection. If we are faithful, we will disappear, but there will be a resurrection." Now, it is accurate to say that this could have been said by both Jin and Gong, by those in either the above-ground communities or the underground, who resisted in different ways. Emerging from the historical realities of China's two Catholic communities are two narratives that permeate the local and the global, actually, impression of China's Catholic Church. One narrative emphasizes persecution and suffering, as can be seen in the Cardinal Kong Foundation, and another narrative emphasizes perseverance and bridge building, as can be seen in the U.S.-China Catholic Association. I'm not here to say that one is right or wrong, but rather it is a matter of emphasis. And I just want to here plug, the reason I brought this up is that Father Rob Carbonell will be speaking of this, I suspect, throughout the rest of our conference. So here I'll take a wide turn away from discussing China's Catholic, away from discussing the past of China's Catholic Church, and I'll turn finally to its present and future. On his 86th birthday, Pope Francis, this was in 2022, Pope Francis authorized the Vatican dicastery to declare Matteo Ricci, the Vatican dicastery for the cause of saints, to formally declare Matteo Ricci venerable. Matteo Ricci is now on his way to being recognized a saint in the Catholic Church, and this is why I've spent so long just now outlining some of the notable events of China's Catholic past, because as the Pope also recognizes, China is a culture that has always valued continuity rather than rupture, which is, after all, a salient part of the Confucian virtue of filial piety. By recognizing the legacy of the Church's past, we can better recognize the legacy of hope that shall usher China's Church into its future. So where are we today? And what signs of hope can we see for China's future? Last year, in 2023, the Archbishop of Hong Kong, His Eminence Cardinal Stephen Zhao, who will be appearing in a video for us, visited the Beijing Cathedral and prayed Vespers with the faithful. Also in attendance were Hong Kong Auxiliary Bishop Joseph Ha Qixing and the Bishop of Beijing, Li Shan. Not only was this gathering largely unprecedented since 1949, but Matteo Ricci's iconic era of friendship was prominently displayed as these three prelates gathered in Beijing. So I'll use just the last several minutes of my talk to consider the Church in China during Pope Francis's time. Much has happened and is happening since his election to the chair of St. Peter in 2013. More images from Shanghai's archives. Between the May 4th movement in 1919 and the election of Pope Francis, China's Catholics have confronted several colossal historical events. Mao Zedong pronounced the beginning of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Catholic resistance to the new government continued until foreign missionaries were deported, largely in the 1950s. The so-called Rome Independent Association was established in 1957. Religion in China was pushed underground during the Cultural Revolution, re-emerged in the 1980s. Various laws were passed, and in 2000, of course, Pope John Paul II canonized 120 martyrs of China, causing a new stir. Of course, non-Chinese clergy have been in China through all of these events. And even today, Western priests do live in China, though they do so not as official missionaries. The most famous Jesuit to have lived through the Maoist era and someone who became one of China's most influential bishops during the communist era was Bishop Jin Luxian, who I've already mentioned. Jin died just 1 month after Francis became the first Jesuit pope in the Catholic Church. Now, I could say much about Bishop Jin as an example of a Jesuit interlocutor with China's modern government and society, but I'll now turn directly to Pope Francis, who has been much in the global media because of his accord with Beijing. Before noting a few recent media reports related to Pope Francis's method of dialogue with China, I should quickly acknowledge the provisional Vatican agreement made with Beijing in 2018, renewed in 2020, and soon to be renewed again. In 2018, Pope Francis signed an agreement between the Vatican and China's government that gave the Holy See the power to approve or disapprove the election of Chinese bishops. It was the first official communication between China's authorities and the Holy See since the advent of Communist China more than 7 decades earlier. While copies of the agreement remain undisclosed, the Vatican press office has revealed that they, quote, exclusively treat the process for the appointment of bishops, and that they do not cover direct diplomatic relations between the Holy See and China, the juridical status of the Catholic Chinese Church, or the relations between the clergy and the country's authorities, close quote. These agreements between the Vatican and China focus more on providing freedom of religious practice. In this case, the freedom for China's Catholics to have bishops in full communion with the Pope, than on providing a platform for discussing religious belief. The social landscape that Matteo Ricci lived within no longer exists in China, and the language of dialogue is thus largely different today in the 21st century. Now, this agreement, which is, we should recall, provisional, aligns with the method of dialogue with China that began with Matteo Ricci in the late 17th century. That's an important point. In 2017, 1 year before Pope Francis signed the agreement, his confrere, Father Joseph Jian, published an essay in La Civiltà Cattolica entitled Catholicism in the 21st Century that unmistakably expresses Ricci's method of Christian dialogue with China, and even more, it clearly describes the rationale behind the 2018 agreement. Quote, because China is so different from the rest of the world, the Chinese Catholic Church needs to learn how to deal with the local culture and political authority. In other words, while keeping its Catholic identity, the Church has to re-establish a Chinese Catholic Church with Chinese characteristics if it is to enculturate church teachings and gospel values that are relevant to the Chinese people. Close quote. Now, in this quote, note how well Jiang's assessment conforms with the traditional 3 elements, long held, of China Catholic dialogue. First, he responds to China's historical context, alluding to the circumstances as they developed after the 1919 May 4th movement. He even explicitly mentions the movement's 2 legs of reform, culture and politics. Second, he insists upon the need for China's church to keep its Catholic identity, but not in an ineffectively ossified manner. He astutely borrows from China's party terminology, recommending a church with, quote, Chinese characteristics. And thirdly, Jiang promotes a form of exchange that is relevant to both Christians and non-Christians, thus suggesting a way to keep the the avenues of dialogue open between the church and the political authorities in Beijing. As if to echo the diplomatic wisdom of John Mearsheimer's realist school, Jiang also stated that while maintaining its Catholic faith and identity, quote, the Chinese Catholic Church will have to redefine its role and relationship with the party and its ideological theories. This does not necessarily mean that the church has to agree completely with party politics and values, but it must find flexible and effective ways to continue its mission and ministry in China, close quote. Now, one can read between the lines several historical antecedents. The Edict of Toleration in 1692, the Edict of Prohibition in 1724, the rights controversies, the May 4th movement. Whatever criticisms of the Pope's 2018 agreement one might find in the media, the agreement in Joseph Jiang's 2017 essay displayed cohesive alignment with the Catholic method of Christian dialogue with China that began nearly 5.5 centuries ago. As I move to my conclusion, I'd like to briefly address how global news sources have responded to Pope Francis's approach to China. Most commentary on the Sino-Vatican agreement and on the Pope's public statements related to China have been polarized. Our present time is an era of polarization, I think often unchecked by the mitigating influence of historical literacy. In both the secular and Catholic media, opinions of Pope Francis's dialogue with China are predictable. He is depicted as either betraying the church in China or as overly cautious in his negotiations. He either goes too far or not far enough. Recent media criticisms have asserted that the Pope has not sufficiently affirmed his opposition to issues related to human rights and religious liberty. But despite the ideological polarization one sees in the media, Pope Francis continues to do what church representatives have done since the era of Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci. He views Christian dialogue as a long-term project that is most effective when it is historically grounded, faithful to its religious aims, and preserves the avenues of communication. So, in just the last several years, a spate of articles about the Vatican's dialogue have appeared, each one either rejecting or supporting the Holy See's consistent engagement with China's government. The Vatican News Dispatch explained that the agreement only regards, quote, the process for the appointment of bishops, and continues to clarify that its aim is to, quote, permit the Catholic faithful to have bishops in full communion. There are just a number of these articles in several news sources. The New York Times published an article that mentions the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to the Vatican in an unsuccessful attempt to stop the renewal of the 2018 agreement, while also mentioning human rights issues within the Great Wall. The Times, as if briefly echoing the Church's long method of religious dialogue, recognizes the agreement's utility in keeping, quote, an open and constructive dialogue. Finally, a Reuters article attempted to represent Pope Francis's view on why he signed the 2018 agreement. Reuters article entitled Pope Defends Deal with China succinctly summarizes the Pope's justification as, quote, an uneasy dialogue is better than no dialogue at all. Pope Francis stated with equal conciseness that, quote, China is not easy, but I'm convinced that we should not give up the dialogue. Looking back into the Church's long historical experience of dialogue and exchange with China, one can easily imagine these precise words uttered by Matteo Ricci, Johann Adam Schaumann Bell, Giulio Valeni, Martino Martini, and Chinese prelates such as Bishop Zhu Kaiming, Bishop Deng Yiming, and Bishop Jin Luxian. By considering missionary and Vatican dialogue with China across the longue durée, one better understands the distinctions and continuity between Matteo Ricci and the current agreements. Historical context, an agile commitment to Catholic belief, and a determination to maintain open communication are as active in contemporary church dialogue with China as during the Ming and Qing dynasties. So I'll conclude with two quotes, one by Ignatius of Loyola and another by his successor in the Society of Jesus, Pope Francis. Ignatius's spiritual exercises begin with one of the most eminent assertions of all of Ignatius's writings, the famous presupposition. He wrote that, quote, "Every good Christian ought to be more willing to give a good interpretation to the statement of another than to simply condemn it," close quote. Pope Francis said to a group of Asian students visiting Rome in 2021, quote, "All wars, all struggles, all problems that are not resolved with which we face are due to a lack of dialogue." Dialogue. Dialogue. This is a potent and appropriate word here because it implies horizontal rather than vertical movement. It recommends community before authority. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that authority is not salutary, nor am I denying the divinely appointed authority of the Holy See. I'm not saying that. But I am saying something that should be obvious to those who are attentive to our global culture as it is now. Current research reveals that people are more convinced by the horizontal influence of community than the top-down model of authority. Certainly, Catholics now and always will turn to the Pope as the leader of the Church. But today, more than in the past, people respond to the people around them for their choice of affiliation. Perhaps China is best poised to facilitate this approach. For the Confucian social order centers primarily on relationships and accepts authority once those relationships are properly ordered. When Chinese Christians imagine community, they're often drawn to Hebrews 10, quote, "And let us consider how we may encourage one another toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but reassuring one another," close quote. In other words, Christians are summoned to encourage and reassure one another by being together, by being in relationship. One of the first books I read as a graduate student was The Monks of the Mencius. In the Tonglen chapter of the Mencius, written more than 3 centuries before the life of St. Paul, we hear the following advice, quote, "Between father and son there should be affection, between sovereign and minister there should be duty, between husband and wife there should be attention to purposes, between old and young there should be an appropriate order, and between friends there must be trust." I'm almost finished, by the way. These 5 descriptions comprise the so-called lun, or 5 relationships that form a community. These 5 relationships help one to become what Confucius defined as ren, or benevolent. Pairing St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews with the Chinese virtue of community, Mencius also said something like "ren zhe wu di," or "the one who is benevolent has no enemies." And let us remember that the Chinese character for benevolence, ren, means a person with another person, or a community. That's what the character means. According to St. Paul and the Confucian writer Mencius, human persons are called to be in relationship, to be a community. And dialogue is the bedrock of both relationships and community. So how is China's church keeping the hill still green? It continues to flourish and bear seed because it continues to remain Catholic and Chinese, Christian and Confucian, loyal to Christ because he is our hope for the future of community. In a recent conference at the Pontifical Urban University in Rome, Pope Francis said that Chinese Catholics, in communion with the Bishop of Rome, walk in the present time and within the context within which they live now. Echoing the Pope's message of China's abiding Catholic faith and its ability to remain in dialogue with the Holy See and its current historical context, The Bishop of Shanghai, Joseph Shanbin, announced at the same conference in Rome, quote, "We in China will continue to build the church into a holy and Catholic church that conforms to God's will, accepts China's rich traditional cultural heritage, and remains in dialogue within its current context." Close quote. In the opening remarks of his papers, the papers that Nicolas Trigot discovered near Ricci's deathbed, Ricci had written that, quote, "This whole missionary expedition to which I am now writing is divinely directed, since it is entirely devoted to bringing the light of the gospel to souls," close quote. I think no one here can reasonably deny the challenges faced by all countries where the gospel struggles to serve as leaven. But I'm certain that if Matteo Ricci were here with us now, and through the rest of our gathering through this weekend, he would rejoice in the green hill of China's church, and he would rest assured in China's hopeful Catholic future. Thank you. And I love this photograph. Thank you.
Should I stay here or there? Thank you, so much, Dr. Klaus. You always provide us with fascinating information about the Church of China. Seems like there's so much to know, so much still to know. At this time, we're going to into the question and answer. So if you have a question for Dr. Klaus, is there a microphone there? Oh, you got it? Okay, thank you, Linda. Just raise your hand and she'll run to you.
Yes, I will.
Dr. Clark, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about the two narratives. One is the one persecution that's focused more on the persecuted church in China, and the other one is the more focused on perseverance and bridgebuilding. My question is, do you know if there's any dialogue in between these two narratives, the two nations and two approaches?
I think there is dialogue. I think there needs to be more dialogue, which is precisely one of the results I hope that emerges from our gathering. There's so much research, there's this research project that shows that when you take children and have them play war games with each other, they start to live into that and dislike one another. And the only way to sort of reconcile them is to give them common projects. And by giving them common projects, suddenly they rebuild community, right? All the psychology professors at my university talk about this particular research project. I think it really is time, and this is a significant thing, for us to emphasize that very thing more that you mentioned. Too often we exist in two different silos, and we don't really communicate. So I think there needs to be a lot more dialogue in terms of those two different narratives. Those narratives need to come together. And one of the things that I've experienced, and I've lived in China many years of my life since the 1990s, is that when you sit on the steps at churches with Chinese Catholics, they have both narratives just in one person, right? So they'll talk about their life during the Cultural Revolution. It was a very difficult time to practice their faith as Catholics. But then in the 1980s, of course, Deng Xiaoping opens the churches again. And I have a photograph of the first Mass held in Beijing Cathedral. And there's nowhere to sit. And everyone's smiling and happy. So both narratives are there. And so I think we need to have more dialogue so that we stop thinking that it's either one narrative or the other. It really isn't. The Chinese church has both narratives at the same time. Is it possible to affirm and appreciate the Pope's action in 2018 in the direction he's taking, and also at the very same time acknowledge the very high price paid. I can't imagine that the bishops who are approved by the current Chinese government are greatly more attained than those who are denied. Yeah, so I love this question because it's very straightforward. It actually, if I think if you were paying close attention, you notice that my remarks were rather optimistic. And I acknowledge that. And I think keeping in the theme of the conference, I really want to underline the ideal and virtue of hope. Ratzinger used to say quite often, the Christian virtue of hope is having it now. The thing you hope for later, you get when you begin to hope you have it now. But the question of the agreement and its results, I'm going to say I think that our guest bishop and fellow priests here, priests from the mainland, know better than I do about the complications of that agreement. I can say this. I sat in, well, if you know the landscape of the church, I had an email exchange with one bishop who thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened. And I had another email with a cardinal in Hong Kong who said the very opposite. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to the church. And both of them had fantastic, a litany of examples of the suffering and the benefits, right? So let me say from my own personal thought, I was in 2019, I was in China and I was walking to a Marian pilgrimage site. And this is 2019, and the priest on the walk with me up to the Marian site was telling me all the very dire challenges that they were confronting. So it's not all easy. I mean, I've sat on the porch at churches with people crying about some of the struggles, Catholics. So I acknowledge the challenges, and there are challenges. And I also have sat in parlors with many Chinese bishops, and they all have different stories. In fact, I'm on a panel with Father Carbonneau and Dr. Wu Xiaoxi, and I'll be talking about specifically an encounter I had with 3 bishops, above ground, and an underground bishop in China, who all lived together. So the complicated realities of the church in China are so nuanced, so nuanced.
I'd just like to share an experience I had that I think in a simple way affirms what you've been saying about community and dialogue. I've been a parish priest in South Carolina who, because I love trains, went to China a number of years ago so I could ride trains pulled by steam engines, which happened to be in Manchuria, and my guide was a young man from Shenyang. And as a matter of fact, we went to Mass at Bishop Paul's Cathedral. But some years he was of no religious background whatsoever. And that was the first time he ever met a Christian or gone to a Christian service. But he came to visit me a few years later for a number of weeks at the time when it was easier for a while to get visas in both directions. And being with me, well, he saw a lot of the church. And he saw something in our bulletin about something called RCIA, for people that wanted to know more about Christianity. But he said, could I go to it? I said, of course. And I said, what is it that's making you interested in Christianity? And he said, when I see the way the people treat each other. When he went back to China, he lived in Dongguan, but he got to go monthly to Guangzhou to the RCIA, one of the churches there. 2 years later, I went over to be his godfather at the Easter Vigil. And community is what attracted him. And people being happy to be supportive of one another.
Thank you. I like that you like Chinese trains. I spent a lot of time on Chinese trains, and I once I was chatting with a group of people on a train in the 1990s, and there was this kind of discussion, and it was 中国火车等于什么? 中国或者等于啤酒和瓜子。That is, what does a Chinese train equal? It equals beer and seeds, and melon seeds, which is so. But that doesn't that speak to community as well, right? This idea of sitting around sharing melon seeds on the train. I love that story.
I want to commend you, Dr. Clark, and our previous speaker of the importance of dialogue and community, because we tend to characterize the Western civilization as individualistic and the Catholic Church as private devotions. That problem persists worldwide. It's not just here in the US, clearly in China, and I've traveled enough to know it's worldwide. And so your insight has to be applied at the very basic level of our church. I mean, if we go to St. Vincent de Paul Church tomorrow, you will see people will go to church and they will leave. There is no sense of community, no sense of dialogue. We need to rebuild that at the very fundamental level of our faith.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could compare or contrast the response Pope John Paul had to the USSR, to the current bishops' dialogue with the CCP. I'm not implying that the USSR and the CCP are exactly comparable in any way, but I'm curious to see what you would say to the effectiveness of previous John Paul's response, and indeed, in much earlier times when Christianity was introduced in many other countries, and it was controlled or persecuted, where the effectiveness of previous responses of popes or bishops, and if this is unique in any way, or if this is new.
I'm a historian of China, and I'm also a historian of Imperial China, and my PhD is in Han Dynasty China. So Lenin and that era is sort of beyond the sweep of my deep reading, but there is a great difference in terms of the matrix of Russia, right? So you have orthodoxy, you have a very different landscape of Christian practice than you do in China. And China's, some people ask me should we send more missionaries to China? And my question is, my answer is always the first missionary to China went in 635. It's not a missionary church. They're older than the church here. So China's church is old. So the context is very different. I don't quite know how to answer that except for First John Paul II, being Polish, was raised in a context where he encountered a kind of Leninist form of Marxism in a way that China didn't. I would want to say that we have to look to Mao Zedong to find nuances in China that are very different. But all that is to say, both have had great challenges. The only last thing I would say by way of a semicolon is that I think it's more edifying to compare China to Vietnam than it is to compare China to Russia at the end of the day. At the end of the day. And the way Vietnam handled the Catholic hierarchy, I think, is probably better than the way China has handled it. But then again, recently, China's Catholic Church, I think, is even having a different kind of thing as Vietnam. But I would say a better comparison is Vietnam. And I have a hard time putting John Paul II into the mixture because of his particular Leninist, kind of Leninist Marxism that defined what he confronted. So that's more of a complicated answer than I intended. That's a good question.
Thank you. I think we have time for only one or two questions. Quick.
our attention to a different kind of dialogue. Instead of the oppositional, antagonistic relationship between the divided church, I have a question and also a hope, because our conference theme is about hope. My hope is for Catholicism to be more present in the wider Chinese society, to have a voice. Myself, because I'm originally Chinese, literally I can say I'm swimming in the ocean of Chinese content. And where are the Chinese on WeChat? And what's missing is content that reflect not direct preaching or conversion to Catholicism, but content that reflects very deeply Catholic social teaching, things that aspect that both Catholics, the Church, and also the wider society, their common concerns. In those areas, that I hope that the Church will have a more, I would say, presence in a way that's not necessarily direct. Because when we talk about the reaching, we also think about the indirect approach. And I think that's what I'm hoping for. There are things that can be done for Catholicism to be more present to Chinese. Because as someone who's spent, I would say, confess that every day you spend quite some time on WeChat, I'm missing that voice, that things that I can read in French or in English, and that they're not present in Chinese content. I'm hoping for more of that. Thank you.
I love that. That's why I ended with Ignatius's famous presupposition, right? That we assume the best in others. And I have to say too, this by way of kind of responding to that almost tangentially, there are so many things about the church in China that we can learn from. For example, I know I attend Mass on Sundays, and so many people are on their cell phones during Mass. Now maybe they're saying in office, I don't know, but there are cell phones happening all around during Holy Mass. And the last time I was in China, there was this lovely sign that said, in the church as you entered, the apostles didn't have cell phones, so we don't need them either. And there was a very beautiful talk about being present to the Mass. And there are also interesting differences. You know, I love comparing these things because they bring joy to our dialogue. China, in the Western Church, when the priest elevates the host, what do we do? What do we ring? Bells. What did they do in China classically during the elevation of the host? You ignite firecrackers. So, I mean, I love this story because the first time Western priests would go to China and during Mass elevate the host, there was this string of firecrackers that was lit and always stunned the priest. But there are so many wonderful and salutary things, and really being present in the church in China, I think that's a good goal for us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.